Greetings, everyone, and welcome to the Complexity Lounge. Back in September 2025, we invited Jen Briselli and Kyle Godbey to the lounge to discuss the practical application of complexity science in American organizations. And now we have them back to continue the conversation. We'll dig deeper into the realities of working in a messy human landscape of everyday practice through stories of success, failure, translation, compromise, and potential. So just to remind everybody, Jen is a strategist, designer, researcher, and educator who helps teams realize the transformative potential of risky play and transdisciplinary collaboration. And Kyle is an ex-sound designer and recovering process engineer, currently working as a service designer, facilitating methods based on complexity science, sense-making, and narrative research. So Jen and Kyle, welcome back to the lounge.
Thanks.
Thank you, Jocko.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks everyone else for showing up, because you don't have the excuse of being curious about the mysterious part of it now. You know exactly probably what you're in for, and yet you still came back. So much appreciated. So if you joined us last time, today's session will look a little different structurally, but it's in the same spirit. And we're going to talk just in a moment about how we're going to kind of roll today, but also consider it pretty open, and we can certainly flex as we go. I'll just give you a little bit more background on me, not a full origin story, because we did share more of that in the first session back in September. And if you haven't watched that, certainly it's not too late. Go watch it after today. But essentially, I started what probably eventually led me into this community in this world many, 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 many years prior to that. When I was in school, I studied physics as an undergrad. And I realized that I didn't really want to go to grad school for physics, even though I really probably would have enjoyed it. I didn't really want to climb higher inside of what I sort of saw as like a disciplinary silo, because I was interested in far too many other things and was studying and double majoring and minoring and talking to people all over the campus. And this was even before, I was in college. I just liked studying everything. And I suspect a lot of folks here in this kind of world also have those similar instincts and just like learning a lot of things. So I was enjoying doing a lot of peer tutoring at the time. And my logic thought, maybe I should be a teacher. I'm enjoying that. So I went and became a high school physics teacher, did that for almost a decade. That was a lot of fun for a while, until eventually it started to feel like I was solving the same design brief or kind of experiencing the movie Groundhog Day over and over and over again. And there are also other aspects of education in the States that we can talk about another time that, I saw the writing on the wall as to where we were headed with outcome-driven education and such. So I ultimately made my departure, and I had serendipitously just discovered the world of information design and experience design at that time. So I went back to school and studied that, which really amounted to design strategy, service design, things of that sort. But a lot of that pulled on systems science of various forms, which in turn drew back onto things I studied and loved in my physics degree. And so ultimately moved into the world of design. A lot of you coming into this chat today probably have some design or design adjacent sort of interest or sensibilities. And so I am kind of one of you guys in that way, but this is where the systems and the complexity started to be pulled in. So I'll spare the rest of it. I spent several years in a couple different places, including one really cool agency. And then eventually they got acquired and I jumped ship and started my own thing because I'd had enough working for other people. So that's me. Kyle, you want to go? And then we can talk about today's agenda.
Yeah. So from a different angle, but meeting in the same place, I started my career in music and movie production, and was working in a creative space with creative people, and we were making things. We were part of music scenes that were coming together. We were producing things that were working. It wasn't anything that I was putting a lot of thought into. How do creative people make things that never existed before? And how do we collaborate? We just did it. And then 9/11 happened and the bottom dropped out. We didn't think we were going to enjoy nice things anymore. And so a lot of that creative world went away pretty quickly. And I ended up in the corporate space. And I was told that the way people collaborate are through things like Six Sigma and lean. And I fought this sort of tooth and nail, but I learned it and I started breaking the rules and explaining why I was breaking those rules and how I was breaking those rules. So I spent the next maybe 25 years until now working within a lot of that process space to begin with. Really just defying a lot of that, being over constrained by process and swim lanes and straight lines and boxes. until I started to find things like design thinking and agile. And again, on paper, I thought this looked really good, but I really pressed on the edges of that and challenged that because that didn't make a lot of sense to me. That's not how people came together and shared ideas. And we respected the various experiences of people and how they came to this spot and what their interests were and how are we going to create the jazz band from this strange roster. That was not what on paper, that's what Agile said often, but that's not often what we did. And design thinking wanted to do that, but then it kind of, refined us into a funnel. So I fought against that a bit. And then I tripped over service design and I said, at least this acknowledges the orchestration. So I've kind of clung to that for a bit because it's a good inroad. It's a common language within organizations. So today, that's my title as a service designer. And I've clung to that because trying to invent soft, weird titles for myself hasn't done me any good, although I've tried. That's service design is what I've sort of utilized for its orchestration, but maybe I guess officially I found a lot of this complexity work maybe 5-6 years ago now, and realized this is the language I've been looking for. This is all the whiteboards that I've been scribbling all over for the past 25 years. This is the stuff that I thought I was alone trying to figure out. Now I suddenly had the language for it. I had other people that were pursuing this. I had other people that had been developing things. And so once I connected to that, the doors opened up and I've been working on this ever since. So I've been working within large organizations for 25 years now, experimenting with this, but now in a much more official capacity for the past 5 or 6. So that's me.
So what we're going to do today is kind of pick up where we left off last time. I should probably mention for those who have like no clue, if you didn't join last time or if you haven't heard or been party to anything since, we did appear here in the lounge earlier this fall, and that day we used a tool called Menti, where we were basically able to solicit questions from people and put them up on screen. It was something you kind of access via your phone or the browser. We aren't going to mess with that today, but that was a pretty cool way to see what kind of questions people were really most interested in hearing us explore or in sharing their own stories about. And Kyle and I came away from that day feeling like, God, like we didn't even scratch the surface. And I actually felt like we didn't scratch the itch. We made it worse. I felt like we were like, oh my gosh. So what Kyle and I ended up doing after that day was thinking about how to continue this conversation. And we actually went off and decided to keep talking about a lot of the themes that came out of that day, as well as the questions that emerged that we felt like really weren't done any justice during that session. And he and I basically just started recording those conversations. I wouldn't call it a podcast. I think he and I have both deliberately wanted to avoid the word podcast in the sense that there's something nice about a low fidelity version of that, but it's a series of recorded conversations. We didn't edit anything. We basically just picked a few things that had been emergent from that day that we never had a chance to address, and then just talked and waited to see where it went. So at this point, there's several, but we would say that the first handful we did, maybe 3 or 4 of them, we were really addressing things from the first session. So if you guys haven't seen any of that stuff, totally encourage you to go watch it and then come find us like on LinkedIn or wherever, because we want to talk to you about it. But I suspect for anybody who was here that time and left feeling like, ugh, you guys might enjoy watching some of that stuff. So it's very low fidelity, as I said, very meandering, but we are having fun doing it. So we're going to continue doing it, and we're going to be inviting people to join us in those conversations. So we definitely encourage you guys to check that out. But today is more about being able to bring all your voices in live instead of being the passive consumers of that YouTube channel. And so the first thing I want to do in a nod to Kyle's usual cue is that if you want to put your LinkedIn in the chat to encourage other people to find you, go ahead and do that. Obviously, there's no pressure, but everybody here is usually very enthusiastic about finding other folks. And that's one way to do it. Barbara, I see your hand up. Are you raising your hand?
I am raising my hand. Kyle, could you drop the link to the YouTube channel that Jen just referenced into the chat? Oh,
yeah, it's in there.
Already
as always.
It's almost like we planned it, but we actually didn't. So as for today, here's what's going to happen. So we picked one of the questions that came up in that first session that he and I haven't really actually gone back to talk about. And we're going to talk about that. Like, we have made a point to not think about it. So I'm going to read it in a moment and we're going to just respond to it. And I suspect hopefully this will be one that you guys were curious to hear about from our experience kind of messing around in the real world with a lot of these complexity informed methods and strategies and such. But then after a certain little bit of time we'll spend responding to that, we're going to throw you guys into breakout rooms to go talk to each other about it, about the topic, about the prompt, about what you heard us say. If you want to be like, Jen's full of shit, you can talk to these other 3 people in a small safe space about it, whatever you want it to be. And after we do those breakouts for a little while, we'll come back into the main room and then have some time for Q&A. And we'll invite you guys to add questions or push the discussion in wherever direction it goes. Then we'll do that a second time with another prompt that we've got on hand, because we think it's one that people are talking a lot about these days. And we were like, why don't we bring this up and talk about it? Again, we'll do breakouts. And again, we'll come back into the main room. And then that last time we're in the main room, any remaining time, we'll do Q&A like usual. We'll enlist the help of Barbara and Tiani and folks for, raising the hand and all that stuff. But that's the plan. So I'm giving you advance warning. And if you're a kind of person who hates breakout rooms and you're like getting ready to hit exit, just know that you don't have to go into the breakout rooms when we do those sections. You can opt to stay in the main room and leave your camera off until we come back. It's not a big deal. Also note that the breakout rooms do not get recorded. So if you're watching this recording later, sorry guys for those blank spots. But for everyone else, what you say to the folks in the breakouts won't be recorded. Kyle, anything to add before I read the prompt at you?
No, I was just about to toss the prompt to you, but go ahead.
Oh, well, I'll read it to you so you can kind of like go first, since I've just been talking at everybody for a little bit. All right. So this prompt was one that came out of that day. And like I said, we kind of never really addressed it in our recorded conversations. So the question is, how do you bring others along with complexity informed, participatory approaches? Especially if folks are used to other approaches, e.g. command and control or more linear kinds of things. So how do you bring folks along?
That's easy. It depends. Cool. Thanks, everyone. That's the end of our talk.
Hey,
yeah. So, no, it depends on who we're talking to, of course. I like to read where people are in their arc, in their sort of understanding, not just of the situation that we're in, but also their feeling for where they are in what they've attempted already. So I think many you've heard me say, I feel like the ambulance chaser of complexity. I talk to people when I feel like they are ready because they have attempted so many other things. They're now a bit beaten up. They've banged their head against walls. They've been told that this way of doing things, this building 6-month roadmaps, this having KPIs or OKRs sets that they have to align to and keep the train on the rails consistently. This is the way to do things. And it's with a small group of people. You can have experts represent everyone else, keep scope small, all of that sort of stuff. That's just the iron triangle way of doing things is how we've always done things. Let's make that work. And they come back and they finally feel like they've exhausted that. I'm looking for that person that says, I think I'm ready to move past that. And maybe they're not explicitly saying it, but you can tell through their exhaustion that they're not there anymore. When I'm talking to people that are coming back and saying, I just need you to find me the right expert that is going to represent everyone else for me, or I need you to get me the 6-month roadmap that will work for me, that's not somebody that's ready. I think they still need a little bit more time. And sometimes I'll be part of that. Sometimes I'll say, I need the service blueprint that's going to tell me how people do decision making. Well, that's not what service blueprints are really about. Service blueprints are kind of like linear transactions. But I don't mind showing you this very lo-fi representation of that. We'll do it real quick. Hopefully the aha is, oh, this doesn't satisfy any of my questions or what I need. So I've done that a few times, sort of I call it the Matador approach. Let them put their energy into it and sort of like exhaust that. And when they get a little tired, then say, I've got some alternate methods over here. Let's try this. They're squiggly lines, but it's okay. It's safe. But it really, again, it depends. And there are some people that I talk to that come in and say, this is complex, but I don't know what to do about it. And one thing that I think is resounding across all of these, though, is that a little bit of validation goes a long way. When people are exhausted, when they say they are trying things, when they are recognizing the complexity of things and that they do feel a little bit disarmed, recognizing that vulnerability and saying, yeah, this is how these things work. You're not supposed to have all the answers. You're not supposed to be in a position where you can deliver the type of confidence that you might want to, or the certainty that you want to. The idea of planning to the extent that you want to, or delivering a vision that's ambitious that is what you've come up with, those things aren't necessarily supposed to be within your grasp. And it's okay that you feel stretched and extended, because that's, for some reason, that's how we've been working, and that's really difficult to do. That little bit of validation, I see people's shoulders drop all the way, and I get a lot of buy-in from that, where I can start offering things. And from there, I do not start quoting philosophers. I do not go to theory. I don't use the word theory. That's an easy way to be discredited. I used to say complexity theory. I now say complexity science. Complexity theory gets me ushered out the door.
Is it because you got your hand slapped last time? Just kidding.
Oh, always. Not last, always.
I mean, last session, last complexity.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. Yes. Thank you. I forgot about that, but now it was recorded. And I take liberties with some of the names. If people want to do a strategy session and they just need help putting that together, I don't come in and say, we're going to do estuarian mapping. I might facilitate estuarian mapping, but I'll call it a strategy session, and that's fine. And then when people want to know more about it, I will offer that. But I always say I feel like I need to serve the sausage before offering to show how it's made, because if you nobody asks for your cookie recipe before they've tried the cookies. That's probably a better metaphor than watching sausage get made, because that's kind of gross. But nobody wants to watch sausage get made is the point, unless they're ready to go make your sausage because it's that fantastic. So I've now crossed metaphors. And
I was going to say, that was like the meme with the two trains that run into each other. It's like one metaphor and then the next metaphor and the next one. Usually I'm the one doing that. So
I love
Kyle for the metaphor pile up.
Yeah, I love getting idioms wrong too, or crossing idioms. Those are some of my favorites. But how about you, Jen? How do you do? And I do this internally. Jen, you're an external as a consultant coming in more.
Yeah, it's probably worth calling that out. So yeah. Kyle is now, and for large parts of his career, has been part of internal teams, whereas I have for most of my career been an external person, agent, consultant, whatever. I mean, always part of an organization, but I've spent most of my career in agency or consultancy settings. So it does change the dynamics a little. I have to say, though, I'm kind of like, well, what Kyle said, basically, there's not a lot that I would contrast with, but I will add on to say, as I was reading this question, this prompt, which is pretty much one almost verbatim from the last session, I was really focusing on like the actual word, bring others along, because, that could mean a couple things. So I kind of generally just sidestep the question if it's about persuading. I don't think that's it. And I think, Kyle, you've spoken to all of that pretty well. I mean, there's no part of trying to bring new tools, methods, knowledge, ways of working, collaborating, mindsets. You don't convince or persuade people to do those things. You have to move things around in the environment, cultivate the conditions where people will start to recognize this is a viable path, or that this might be something that could be more desirable than what they're doing right now, which I think Kyle just talked through beautifully. So to that end, my usual response to this question when it's posed is to swipe altogether and say, it's not really about trying to persuade, but if you're trying to earn the right or the space to do things that you know can be more effective than what are happening right now, you have to ask yourself what needs to happen for that space or that trust to exist, because it sort of implies they don't. So I kind of think a little bit about this in two ways. One is, are you building the trust? And how are you doing that? And sometimes that means doing a lot of stuff that you know isn't like the best, perfect, right thing. But again, adding on to everything Kyle said, building trust by doing things together in a way that someone comes to understand that the way you're working together is for a shared purpose and a shared goal, and that you're not just trying to come in with like the newfangled stuff you read about in some paper, and that you're actually trying to achieve a thing rather than just trying to use this environment to be a sandbox for your own intellectual kind of self-gratification, right? And the other is the container. You need a self-container or a safe environment in which folks can actually go, okay, we could try something a little different here. And folks, especially if you're in the States, in corporate environments, there aren't many of those safe spaces. So when you think about, who it is you're bringing along in this question, I hear the implication that it's leadership or it's this or that, or it's my product manager or whatever it is. I think you have to step back and realize it's not because those folks are irrational or stubborn or like intentionally, unwilling to want to try something that could be more effective. They're responding pretty effectively to the incentives of the system that they're working in. So what can you be doing to build not only some safety in the interpersonal relational sort of field around you? What can you also be doing to kind of identify some spaces where things are relatively low stakes, and or you have some kind of cadence of collaboration where sometime down the road you could swap out what you're doing with something else and have it feel like an okay swap because you've built the container. And I say the container, I don't mean obviously physically, I mean the surrounding structure of a relationship or the nature of collaboration, a process, etc. The other thing I'll say briefly is that I also hear when I read bringing others along may not even mean I'm trying to persuade or convince someone to let me do complexity, but it might also mean, how do I keep people from freaking out? Because it does feel relatively uncomfortable for people to work in some of the ways that complexity science and related adjacent, thinking is able to inform our work. And I do think, Kyle, you hit this pretty well too, but the way I often think about this is part of my role is to put people at ease and like remind them someone is here with their hand on the wheel a little bit, or someone is here with their hand on the emergency brake, or someone is here to make sure that like we're not going to just drive off a cliff. And if it's me that can be that, usually that's what I'm doing, whether I'm in a facilitative role or just able to offer that kind of reassurance. But sometimes it means orchestrating something that provides that if it's not me as an individual. So in other words, what we're doing often feels like people are going to close their eyes and do a trust fall, or everybody's going to hold hands and drive off the cliff like Thelma and Louise. It really can feel uncomfortable to try things that are really different from what most corporate environments are doing. And so building something into the process that feels like we're going to avoid getting to the point where everything has gone completely crazy is really key. So just remind people, you're strapped in. It feels like a roller coaster, but you're strapped in and it's safe. Or my hand is on the wheel, or my hand is on the brake. You're driving this car, but I'm the driving instructor in the passenger seat who can hit the other brake at any time. And so that like frees people up a little. So let me pause there. I guess what I'll do is first say, Kyle, if there's anything you want to add. B, we want to throw people into breakouts before we do Q&A. And so, Kinsey, I see your hand up. Is it a question that could wait for Q&A post breakout, or is it something really specific to something I was saying?
It's an additional response that I think complements what you guys have said, if you don't mind.
Is it brief?
Yeah. So okay. Just throw in that you don't have to it doesn't need to be a targeted and shared initiative to work in a way that is in line with complexity or complexity science. And, anyone can do it and bring it to their work. And I've worked in this way and, brought people along for 20 years and without naming it because it wasn't a thing in organizational practice. And it's not even a matter of buy-in. It's just in the way you do the work. And so people are default brought along with the whether they realize it or not. And there's an advantage in that. And now that complexity is kind of a word that's used and consciously recognized, you can point out kind of that's what's been happening all along. And so it kind of gets to what Kyle was saying about, I forget what the second one was, about the sausage and making the sausage. And they've been a part of the sausage making process all along, so it makes it a lot less scary. But there's a thingingness to complexity now, as if it is something to deal with, when it's something that's more of a condition to navigate, and everybody does. So,
yeah, and
go ahead.
No, I wanted to kind of connect that because you reminded me of something that was really important, Jen, and Kinsey. I think you're kind of like hovering around it as well, and that is a lot of. I didn't first start experimenting with this work and learning about it, and then go in and get buy-in. I refined this language by rejection after rejection after rejection, and a lot of that comes from listening to the rejections that you're getting. Ask what's not landing. When people are telling you that this doesn't sound pragmatic enough, that they don't see what this looks like in action, bring it into a day-to-day. When they're saying they can't picture what you're talking about, or that it seems too theoretical, take the feedback, integrate that into the way that you're introducing this, meet people where they are. There's an instinct to walk away and say, well, they're just not going to get it. They're like built for something else. I get that. And that frustration is absolutely valid. And I've definitely gone there. But the refinement comes from listening to that sort of stuff and saying, okay, I do need to land this plane in this particular way for this particular group and experiment with something else. Let's try talking about it in these terms instead.
Yeah. Yeah, and I have many more galloping thoughts to share, but before we do that, I'd actually love to see what comes out of some breakout room generated questions and thoughts. So before I throw folks, you're good to do breakouts, Kyle, you think? Yeah?
Let's do it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Before I do that, though, I also want to call out in the chat. I saw Stephen posted, that he often, forever, he's made the point that workshops are containers, not methods. And I want to highlight that. And then I also want to mention that Stephen actually joined Kyle and me for a recent recorded conversation. We haven't put it up on YouTube just yet, but it'll be up shortly. But it's a really good one. And we do talk about that exact topic, which is probably why I even used the turn of phrase I did today. So credit Stephen for putting that bug in my ear. But really, that piece is really key. And we do expand on it a little bit in that one. So stay tuned for that. So I'm going to open up breakout rooms. I'm going to set the timer for 15 minutes. And like I said, if you really do not want it today, you can just stay in the main room with your camera off for a little bit. And when we come back in, we'll do some more Q&A, and we'd love to hear what this is bringing up for you guys and what you want to hear more of, because we do know also a big part of people's interest was being able to hear more examples or concrete things that work and don't work. That's always kind of the interest for people who are trying to be practitioners and bring complexity science into the actual practice on the ground. So hence the swampy lowlands rather than the high hard ground of technical expertise. So with all that said, go into your breakout rooms here momentarily, talk to the folks you're in the room with about what you're hearing, what this is bringing up for you. And then if there are questions that emerge in your group, capture them so that when we come back, you guys can raise hands and ask them. So let's do 3 to 4 people in a room, and I'll set it for 15, and then we'll come back. Well, I think we got the crew working their way back in. I think everyone should be here. And I encourage everyone to keep their cameras on. I mean, obviously, we're not going to shame anybody if you got to turn them off, but love to see all the faces this time now that you've been in the breakout. So leave them on. What we're going to do now is Q&A for a little bit. And then we're going to kind of, like I said earlier, repeat that process with a different prompt. But before we do that, we did see a question or two in the chat about what is service design, because I know Kyle mentioned that was his title, and that's kind of the closest thing for me to say about my work too. And I will say too, just quickly, it's funny you said like Matador as your metaphor. I find service design is a useful title as well for all the same reasons, except I'm always using the Trojan horse metaphor, or lately like the Indiana Jones kind of swap out. Like you thought you were getting service design, but you're actually getting complexity science. So everybody's got to pick a metaphor here. But for us, service design is where we landed, and the container in which we do it. But there was a question like, what the heck even is service design? And we don't want to spend a ton of time on it. But for those who aren't aware, we say design, we mean something specific. We mean service design, we mean something specific. And Kyle, you had an example that you were going to share to a little.
Yeah, my favorite that seems to land is if you think of a product designer as the person that builds an airplane, they work with the engineers and the product market fit, and they're the electrical engineers and the mechanical engineers, and they're going to build a product and then they're going to send it off into the world to go operate and sell it. It's sort of a one-time build. That's a product designer. Or even UX design kind of does something similar. A service designer designs the airport. And so it is expected that what we're designing has a continuous life cycle that's adapting to everything that's related to it. And so that might be the policies that are happening. It's all the people that are coming in and out, all the vendors that are related to it. It's all the new planes that are coming through, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we are used to designing living spaces.
Okay. Now that's enough on that, because this is about complexity, not design. Yeah. This is not the service design lounge. Thank God. Q&A time. I would be very curious to hear what came up in the breakout rooms, and if there are either questions that emerged that you would like to hear me and Kyle respond to, or if there is anything else that you were kind of hoping to hear us hit on related to that prompt, or anything else that came up. If you have a question and you want to put it in the chat, that's okay, but we would prefer you just raise your hand and ask it. And we'll do this for about 10, 15 minutes, see how it goes, and then we're going to do the second prompt. So what questions came up? None. 0 questions. Everybody has a grasp on everything. And
awesome. Go into the world and influence and spread the world of complexity.
Even if it's not related to the first prompt about bringing people along in complexity science or participatory sort of informed ways of working, if there's anything else on the broader topic of being a practitioner and bringing all these high-flying theories and scientific knowledge kind of insights into the messy day-to-day practice, even that kind of high level, if there's any questions.
We started a discussion, which is probably relevant to lots of people. I couldn't find how to put my hand up, so I just opened and started talking.
Yeah, all good.
But we started a discussion in our little breakout room about the need often to change the language. Not just to not lead with the theory, but not to use any of those words and to come up with your own words. And I know we've talked a little bit about that before, Jen and Kyle. So we'd love to hear your most extreme versions of that and where you would draw the line.
Yeah, I feel like that's a really good one. Kyle and I talked about a little bit too in one of our sessions. I wish I could remember which one, but I've actually even had some sort of updated thinking on this in the last couple of weeks, and I'll say why. I generally am very much a fan of finding the vernacular, the language of the people that you're actually engaging with or collaborating with, and finding ways to talk about whatever it is you're trying to talk about in their language. Sometimes their language doesn't cut it, or sometimes the ways that they use language are actually counter to what you're trying to achieve. But for the most part, say you're doing something like estrogen mapping, right, from the Knevin Co. And they use terms like, it's all, like if they haven't studied Latour's work, then what's an actant, right? What's an actor and a constraint and a constructor? So, that's an easy example to say, I think it can be really effective to use different words that are a little bit more accessible to the crowd if those words would be intimidating to them. At the same time, I think it's really important not to underestimate people's intelligence and their ability to work with information. And I think that it's really important to be thinking about how to introduce new language as the vehicle through which new ideas then move in. So, and that sounds weirdly kind of like contagion, and that's not quite the vibe I was going for, but it is really important, which is why I'm generally okay when people want to correct other people's language if they do it diplomatically, gently, with care, et cetera. And I was actually having a conversation earlier this week with someone who they had been asking me for advice. They were going to do estrogen mapping. And they had asked me for some advice as they were preparing it. And then she came back to share with me how it went, and it went beautifully. And I've encouraged her to tell people about it and to write it up. So hopefully she will. But one of the things that she mentioned was that the folks in the session, she was worried if she used the words like constructor, constraint, and such, that they would be a little overwhelmed or intimidated. And it turned out they weren't. They were like, yeah, we got it. It's good. Because she made a point to explain what those words mean, and not in a super jargony way, but to say constraints either contain things or connect things, talking about constructors as things that enable ongoing processes or through which something is changed. She used sort of relatively accessible language to describe. And so what I heard when she was saying that was, it was less about understanding new vocab, and it was really just finding a way to describe the idea in the vernacular of so even if she used a new word like constructor, she described it in very accessible language. And in that way, you can package two things together, a new word, but an understood idea, and they go together. So I think that for people who struggle with this a little bit, always be looking for the language people are using, but B, don't underestimate your collaborators' ability to actually learn and work with new ideas. You've just got to kind of feel out where the boundaries of that are. And I think more and more lately, I think people are finding it a little bit surprising that, holy cow, like, just because we're all beat over the head constantly with the fact that, again, at least in the States, leaders want a 2-sentence email, must be in bullets. Don't give me any jargon. I don't want any of that. Da, 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 da. I think you kind of like do yourself a disservice to assume that all humans operate that way. I think that's more theater than anything. And so maybe meet people where they are as learners, and you can actually go a little further with some of the language than you think. Kyle?
Yeah. This weekend I was inviting a friend of mine to this talk, and I was trying to explain what we were going to talk about. And I realized I've often said my first talk about this within an organization, I was quoting Derrida and Deleuze, and I'm trying to talk all theory, and I just lost everybody, and it bombed terribly. And it was not the first conversation I ever had on this, or the presentation that I had on this. He reminded me that in 2017, I was still in the product organization at Capital One, and I was doing a product brown bag for the whole product org. And I was presenting on how do we not stay the course. That was my topic. And I didn't know any of this language. I didn't know so much of this stuff. But I did a whole hour-long talk on what can we learn from the production of Jaws, where the shark didn't work and it looked awful and it kept breaking down. And instead they made a good movie that was not focused on filming this mechanical shark floating around. They had to focus on character, and they had to build suspense without focusing on, but they had to do that in the moment, and they had to respond to it. And it was great. And I made a whole lot of references to how that relates to product development and product design. And as I was remembering this, I said, I gotta go rebuild that presentation. And so some of this is you kind of have to forget a little bit of what you know to kind of relate to a lot of people. We get stuck in that I have this language and I have access to all this stuff, and it's going to sort of distance me a bit from people if I'm not careful of that. So how do I go back to some of those roots of when I was tripping over this stuff, and know that that's where people that are curious are going to be, and how do I meet them there? So it's not just about how do I refine the language that I have or the things that I do know, but is there a way to actually forget this sort of stuff? And there's no dumbing it down. That's not a thing. And I find that would be insulting. And I hate the idea of patronizing people, but doing an hour-long presentation on a mechanical shark that didn't work, that made an amazing movie, is I think a solid way to connect to people.
Kyle, you're always using the example of can't trot out Derrida and Deleuze and all that. What do you have against those poor guys? I will trot them out, and I will do it. I'm just kidding. I've had my hand slapped. I'm burned here.
I've been branded as the I can't do it now.
No, but I feel that I will just say, I think that's kind of part of the key is that, hey, we all didn't know this language at some point, right? Everybody in this room is here in a complexity lounge meetup. We all had somebody at some point use some language with us that was intimidating and weird, whether it was new materialism or whether it was something from Santa Fe Institute, or whether it was something about biological evolutionary biology, like it could, whatever it is, we all encountered something, and something made it possible for us to keep going and wanting to explore further. So I think sometimes it's easy to get caught up in like, how do I translate? How do I make a Rosetta Stone? How do I bring this down to the level or meet someone where they're at? The how is really art as much as it is science, and it's from relating and being of and being with the people you're collaborating with, so you can figure out what it take to make it possible for them to keep moving forward with curiosity. More often than not, it's less about creating more things like stepping stones. It's much more just removing the barriers, because sort of, I think learning actually kind of rolls downhill in that way. And so finding out how to work, energy gradients, there we go, right? How to work with the energy gradients when it comes to learning and language building.
Okay, we have a couple of hands up.
So
I'd like to get to those, but I will point out to you, Jen, that Duluth still makes me cry. I believe.
You guys, book club's going to come. We got to do the book club.
Yeah, we're working on it. Okay, I think Kinsey had her hand up first, and then William.
Yeah, something that we talked about language in our breakout, and just often the like what language to use. But I think a key part of it from a complexity standpoint is what languages to use and what vocabularies one uses and when. And so there's that strategic component of gauging, and this is just kind of pulling together some things that have already been sprinkled through, depending on who you're talking to and the stakeholder, the state of readiness. But it also isn't required. So I think I see people sometimes getting hung up on what language to use rather than just doing the work as possible too. And there's an advantage to not calling it out in language sometimes too, because that can prime, maybe I've just said this already, but the idea of multiple languages and the complexity of work, not being talking about it, but how in different ways, and having that agility.
Yeah, I reflect language back on people nowadays too, because I find when people want to say something is complex, sometimes they'll say complex, but more often than not, they start talking like 8-year-olds. It's fuzzy, it's wonky, it's hickly-pickly, it's weird. Like the vocabulary is just very limited, and so was mine like 5 minutes ago. And so I just reflect that same language to them. Yeah, we're all getting together and we're going to do some weird stuff. And I don't start talking about, it's not weird, it's emergent, it's entangled, it's obfuscated. I don't correct that language. I meet that. And again, it's not because I'm patronizing an 8-year-old language. That sounds bad, actually. But like I'm trying to say, like it's the way that people articulate this is about as well as they can. And I think we have to be sensitive to how they're finding this and meeting that there. There's nothing wrong with that language. We have terrible language for this, and our words in general are not really built for this. So metaphors are much better, but just reflecting that language and not trying to throw new words at them is ideal.
Yeah, metaphors, abstraction, embodied activities and exercises that don't need to use words at all. And I think too, I hate to be the person that always does this, but hey man, context dependence. If I'm talking to people who've never encountered these ideas, I don't care if they know what the word complex really means. But if I'm talking to a group of folks that is trying to really get into the differences of the domains in the Cynefin framework, then I am going to be like, well, okay, so technically we're thinking complex this way and complicated that way and such. So it's really also so context dependent, which means you as a practitioner and a collaborator have to really hone your context antenna, so that you can sense where to meet those folks. Somebody in the chat, I forget now, mentioned, zone of proximal development, these notions around learning. And there's a lot, I think, to be unpacked there some other time, because it's really key.
I want to acknowledge something real quick, and that is with this room full of nerds, if you're anything like a lot of us nerds that I know here, we love diving into semantics. Compartmentalize that urge. This is a good place for it. The discourse on semantics is great in the Complexity Lounge. When you're trying to introduce this to new people or find them, not so good. So try to compartmentalize that. That's it.
Terrible advice. Don't do that. I'm just kidding. We'll argue about that some other time.
Okay, you
Right.
can slug it out. Yeah,
Hey, can you all hear me?
Yes.
So I wrote down a few things. Some of them might have been mentioned since I raised my hand. One thing that complexity has made me very more aware of and have a heightened awareness of is the budget of the language that I can introduce, and also it's just like how much time it should take me to explain what we're going to do or what I'm trying to propose. So if I'm running, let's say, for example, an S-Trine mapping, I've really been trying to tune down the rules explanation that I have at the beginning, and try and actually work on building in different affordances that aren't just the language into the materials that I put, the layout, that's the pens, when I put the pens on the table, when I don't put the pens on the table. Because all these things, not just the language, are going to have an effect on how people experience and how people grasp what I'm trying to get them to do. So I am really like board games, and so I also have been looking into board game design. And I'm a rules lawyer, so I like explaining the rules, and I also get experience from that. Trying to explain the rules to people. Sometimes I don't explain all the rules up front because I know people aren't going to remember this one, and I'll explain the rule, this specific rule, when it comes up. And so in a S-Trine framework, I might do that, the same thing. So yeah, metaphors, listening to other people's metaphors, I definitely am a fan of that. I think sometimes we also need to think of how we can get other people talking and not just ourselves. So that's why I like the what keeps you awake at night question and other questions. So if we want to learn what the language of other people are and a bit more about the problem, having good prompts, things that can consistently get people talking about themselves, about their problem, about how they're experiencing things, I think is important. And then a final thing is we don't need to control the outcome. We might think, oh, okay, how do I get people on board with this thing? But then how do I get it to work? And it's a weird experience being facilitating a complex method, because I think the win condition is that you feel completely useless. You haven't understood one thing of what's been happening, but everybody else seems to be really enjoying it and getting a lot of value out of it. So asking a lot of questions of, are you getting value? What are you understanding? Have you been learning new things? But that, if you bring out, if you explain constructor and they run away with it a different way, and they're getting a value out of it, that's fine. That's probably fine. That's where they're at. So we don't need to control how people are using these notions too tightly. We can just throw them out there and see what sticks.
Yeah, I like, well, obviously everything you just said, I feel like, great, done, end of show. But I wanted to respond to two of them and then see if Kyle wants to add on, at least on the last piece about not controlling the outcome. We can say this, and I think a lot of us who have been immersed in complexity for a long time, we can feel it in our bones, but that's really more significant than I think even we usually will acknowledge, is actually being okay with the fact that you cannot really seek to control the outcome. You can shape, you can have scaffolding and such, but I feel like that is actually a lot harder for people to truly internalize and not just say than we all want to admit. So I encourage, the way that it happens is by doing it. So, I encourage people to kind of always be reflecting on that. But I will often say to people when I'm facilitating anything, whether it's an individual activity on a day or a long project, right, with a client, if I've done this well, at the end of all of this, you will forget I was ever involved. I don't want to go too far that direction because I got to still make a living, but it's so different from the way I think a lot of folks are trained in various fields, right? Especially in design. Those of us who are in the design or adjacent fields, so much of the design concept is that I'm the arbiter of taste. I'm the arbiter of the craft, and I'm applying an expertise to the synthesis of these things. And so to flip that script, whether it's facilitating a session where I am facilitative and hopefully invisible in hindsight, is so different. Or if it's a longer term thing where I am trying through, narrative research or what have you, to enable people to be the ethnographers of their own experience, What does that mean for me if my whole identity is tied up in being the ethnographer who synthesizes what I hear? So, I don't want to go so far as to say like we all got some internal work to do, because I have problems with that notion too. But there is a level of we all got some internal work to do here to actually embrace what it means to do work that is informed by this knowledge of how complex systems actually work. And then piggybacking on that, because it is related, you mentioned earlier about rules. I think this is also one of the most common things that folks I know run into when they're trying to start kind of bringing some of these new and different and maybe sexy and a little mysterious, but also scary tools and methods. And you get to this place where you want to explain it so you can take away a little bit of the fear of the unknown for people that you're working with. But to over-explain it, as you've said, it's going to overwhelm. And you also are going to have people who want different things. If you play a board game, I know about you guys, I want all the rules up front because my brain processes better that way. I know plenty of people I play board games with who are like, let's just play it and let's just figure it out. And the first one doesn't count. We're going to play our hand open and like sort it out as we go. And then we'll ask questions, and when we get to a hard spot, we go, what does that rule mean? And then when you try to do something with people of both types, what the hell do you do? And I mean, it's not an easy question to answer, but at least in my work, I have found that there's just a sort of blend of the two. So I'm never trying to sell work in a way that is based on convincing people of why this thing's going to work the way it's going to work or telling the rules of how it's going to happen. I'm just focused on what keeps you up at night. And then when we get engaged in actual collaboration, you do a little of both. At the beginning of something, whether it's a workshop or whether it's a multi-month project, I'm going to focus on the high, broad strokes. This is kind of roughly how it's going to go and how it's going to feel. And then as we get closer and closer down into the work, it gets finer grained and it gets higher resolution. And there's this kind of old adage of, I guess, public speaking maybe more than anything, but it's like, tell them what you're going to tell them, then tell them what you told them. And I do that from like an educator kind of perspective too. Tell them what you're going to tell them, but at the high level. Tell them what you're going to do together at the high level. Then as you're doing it, have them go along and do it and provide those rules or those details as needed. And then even after the fact, it's useful to summarize, although in this case, I wouldn't be summarizing for people. It's inviting that, decision-making together, sense-making together, maybe some reflection together. So that was me just piggybacking on all of this, because I think this is stuff that I get asked all the time, and it's good to just keep saying it out loud for others to hear. Kyle, is there anything you want to add?
Yeah, a couple quick ones. Love asking what keeps you up at night, but I also make sure I ask what gets you up in the morning. They're both just as important to work with. Also, as a fellow board game nerd, I find introducing rules while people have built their strategy or have their sort of understanding of the game starting to cement might throw something. It gets people pissed off when they're like, I thought now you throw this at me. It kind of looks like you're cheating almost. So it reminded me that there are a lot of times that I have these conversations and start introducing things in very casual ways, and they are probably more effective than when people are under the gun. So drop stuff in Slack channels, have coffee chats, say, what are you interested in? And swap some notes around like, yeah, this is the stuff I'm geeking out about. Look at this big star map that I'm playing around with. Look at, here's where I'm nerding out at the moment. Get people sort of curious and interested outside of the I'm under pressure to deliver something and you're the only one that can save me at the moment conversations. Those casual interactions that might provoke a little bit of curiosity go a long way. That you might not hear anything, but I want to say about half of the projects that I've worked on now have come from conversations that started months, maybe even years prior, where someone has come along and said, I think you're the person that does this, right? And it goes from there. It is not from I'm under the gun at the moment and I need you to come in. That's it. We want to shift gears to our second topic?
Yeah, and I don't know. How much do you want to do? How do you want to go into it? Do you want me to read it? Because it actually kind of
abruptly.
Well, it flows from this, and I almost wonder if we want to go a little shorter here and even a little shorter in the breakouts, because I suspect there'll be another spiral up. So the other prompt that we captured for today, largely as a function of both things that did come out of the previous session and also things we've been hearing and seeing and reading in the last several weeks as well, is really the question of how do we invest in the confidence of people who want to learn more about this domain. And I say this domain a little bit broadly, but complexity science and complexity informed practices, as well as the participatory piece. I want to keep that in here. And there was a question in the chat about that maybe we can come back to in the next Q&A. Complexity and participatory. Are they like chocolate and peanut butter, or are they one and the same? More at 11. So, but to that end, essentially, where do you find your community? How do we invest in the confidence of people who are coming into this space, and what line do we walk between holding to rigor or accuracy versus being welcoming and such? So, Kyle, take it away.
Ooh. So this is a big one for me. And I'm probably reaching a little broadly here. So one of the biggest things that helped me get this to gel at Capital One when I was introducing this was meeting the Equity by Design team, who was gaining a lot of traction, had a lot of interest, had a really great language that resonated with the entire enterprise, a lot of attention. But there was this conversation about, well, what do you actually do? And their answer was, well, we train people, we bring awareness to things. And that's good, but then what? And there was, well, that's once we raise awareness, we'll see what happens. And so I kind of acknowledged that we were having a lot of the same conversations. We were acknowledging the plurality of systems. We were realizing that systems were naturally inclusive, and that if we weren't seeing things from multiple angles, we weren't going to be able to understand them. And this wasn't just the benefit of how we were going to sort of coexist in small spaces, but how we were going to innovate in them, and how we were going to adapt to what was coming at us, and how we were going to find potential of systems. And so when we got together and we realized that I was using a language that people didn't understand where to place it, but I had a lot of frameworks and tools and methods that people could actually like sit down in a room and commit a couple hours to and do some things and walk out and say, now I know what to do next. And they had the language that people were attracted to, but no real, here's the thing I'm going to deliver. And at the end of the day, this is what you'll get out of it. We teamed up, and that was massive. So I think one of the biggest ahas for me in that was I now keep an ear open for who is talking about this and not using our language, but is using an adjacent language, has an interest in this space, and how can I connect to them? And not correct, not go in and say it's, Jen and I talk about this a lot with the systems thinking folks. My first instinct isn't to go in and call them colonizers. It is to go in and say, this is where I started too. There was interest here. There is a lot of good stuff that starts here. Let me introduce some other ideas. Let me hear what you're thinking about. What compels you in this space? And it's not just to preach. It's not just to say, come with me. But it is to find that like we're all sort of gravitating in the same area. And this is such a small world that's us going to battle over some of these nuances, some very important nuances. Is not the right way to start that conversation. We can figure that out as we go along, I'm sure. But the initial conversation is to find out where we're actually connected and what we can learn from each other. I find that really advantageous. I'll start from there rather than going through a long list like I did last time.
We know this one's an hour and a half of on its own, if not more. I think this is an interesting question too, because it raises like ye old structural versus individual tension. You can kind of have an argument about, when and how to correct people as they are learning, and, whether we're talking language or other non-explicit things. And also, how do you welcome people along a learning journey that you yourself are also on and just a few steps ahead? And then the limitations of that metaphor, because it implies it's linear. You know what I mean? So I have a hard time with a lot of those sorts of parts of the conversation because they kind of boil down into like two camps. One is like everybody's welcome here, and like we should acknowledge that everybody has a different way of learning and knowing, and it's important to honor and acknowledge there are multiple ways of knowing and being, collaborating. That at the same time, if that's where you land and you don't push back on anything, then how do you actually help people learn more and become a little bit more expert in things that are based in some shared material reality, right? Because we're all trying to actually do something as practitioners that is meant to actually achieve more desirable futures, and to do that, we've got a shared material reality and shared material affordances that we are working with together. So the tension there I find is so interesting because there's a lot of attention lately on the sort of, I say container, but I mean a little differently now, but maybe the environment, the conditions in which we welcome people into this space or into these kinds of topics or et cetera. And we want to be open and welcoming. But at the same time, if they're not actually going to start to work with tools or methods in the ways that we know to be grounded in observable reality, then like what good does that do us? So how do you encourage folks to do that? Well, then it starts to sound like you got to criticize the individual. And I think a lot of this, and I like that this prompt has the word confidence in it, because for me, that's really what it boils down to, is how you are able to help someone be willing to be wrong in the open, to learn publicly, and allow them to get comfortable with getting shot down or challenged by someone, whether that person is more knowledgeable than them and is doing it in a caring way, which would be the ideal, or whether the person who is criticizing or shooting them down is just being a dick on the internet. Regardless of those two scenarios, I would want the individual in question to have enough confidence in themselves to be able to say, okay, some aspect of this is actually useful to me. It's a good sort of compass heading for where I need to go learn and grow a little more, and not internalize it, as a shame kind of based response. And so for me, and this is basically just reinforces what you said, Kyle, but I think this question is the tension between how you do this dissolves when you focus on the word confidence. So what can you be doing at any given time that allows the people you're working with to have a little bit more confidence in their own ability to figure things out? And I can't help it because, the teacher in me thinks about how you help people move through increasing levels of skill development or knowledge, and not learning in a transactional sense, but in Nora Bates and Samathisy sense, right? Like really thinking about how you are adapting and growing in the Deleuzian sense, an encounter with difference, right? So like, how are you actually engaging in that process? And I, as a facilitator, as a collaborator, I'm simply looking at my role as doing anything within my reach to move affordances or change conditions around so that that person can have their encounter with difference, whether it's pleasant or unpleasant, and respond with an adaptive instinct to it instead of shut down and run away. And there's a limit to what you can do in that way because you are not the other person. You can't control it. So we've gotten a little off the reservation on this one, but
no, this is good.
Yeah. Do you want to do
I have a metaphor?
Oh, of course. I love that you're the metaphor guy today. I feel like you're
usually the metaphor.
I am usually. This is a nice change of pace.
So this is not a humble brag, I promise, and I'll land it and it'll make sense.
You humble brag.
I'm usually the humble brag guy. So I was training somebody years ago, a new manager, and just like coaching, and afterwards, this person said to me, "You're like the little league coach that I want my kid to have." You're like correcting them, but you're also like encouraging them like to get back out there and go. And that has stuck with me, not as in a like, like that's that, but as a like, shit, that's to me, that's such incredibly high praise. I don't think that has now a sort of North Star sort of thing that I kind of need to hold myself to. And I think that's the tension you're talking about is maybe the little league coach isn't landing quite for everybody, but it is like how do you get in front of a kid that's learning how to play a new sport, add sport or a new skill, add whatever that skill is, to say it's not like this, it's like that, but do it in such a way that says, but here's what you are doing. Here's why it's important that you're doing this. Here's why you need to be enthusiastic about this. Here's why I'm invested in you. Here's why, like all of the good stuff, but also let's not mince words here. Don't just go out and screw around, or it's not an anything goes kind of thing. Go do it right. Also, you will find it more rewarding when you do, but continue on.
This will be good to unpack later too, because I don't I'm not the little league coach. Those of you who know me kind of well, that's not me. I'm also not the like terrible dance teacher who is like cutting everyone down or anything like that. But I think that it's really also important for folks to figure out what's the authentic role for you. If what we're talking about here is in many ways like an informal apprenticeship kind of way of learning and growing and inviting people into communities of learning and communities of practice, what is your role? Like, in what context are you the apprentice, right? And in what context are you a journeyman or a master? And when you're in one of the latter two, what is your kind of type? Are you the little league coach? Is that your personal North Star? Like, do your values, are you most aligned with your values when that's how you feel? Like, that's you, Kyle. That's not me. I don't know what mine is, and I'll think about the metaphor a little bit, but I always go back to like the notion of risky play. And for me, it would be much more of a compliment to hear, I was terrified to do this thing. You somehow either convinced me it was safe or you tricked me into doing it anyway. And I did it and I didn't die. And I was so happy to realize that. And I've had a lot of people in my life share feedback like that with me. And so if somehow I am simply the facilitator of, I thought I was going to die, but I didn't die, that's great. I love to hear that. But I feel like everybody else in this room and like all however many 30, 40 people listening right now, you've probably got your own personal version of this. And so like, that's something I encourage, is figure it out for you, like what's most important, because that helps you figure out what role you can actively play in building other people's confidence and ultimately propagating so that we have more people who are able to think and collaborate and practice in these ways, which obviously is what we want. It's not like we're trying to evangelize something, but it helps give us more people to actually have fun with. So we're going to do breakouts. Barbara, did you want to hop in before we do that? You're muted.
You'd think I'd know to unmute myself by now, but no. I just wanted to say that listening to the two of you talk, I hear that inside-outside dichotomy a little bit, right? Kyle, Mr. Inside, Jen, like myself, usually an external consultant.
Barbara, we don't like dichotomies here, okay?
I know it's complexity, but in this conversation, there's only two of you, damn it.
Well, we're trying. I'm trying at all times. I'm trying to create a little bit of distance so that there's something interesting. So you're not just getting something in stereo, but you're getting some yin yang, or you're getting some other variation.
It's
Yes, it's a polarity. My entire motivation in our recorded conversations is I'm constantly looking for a place where Kyle can like argue and like violently disagree. And I haven't quite found one yet, but we've got a few.
Right. But that's just another, what I'm thinking about is like another aspect of all of this, right? When you're talking about language and things like that, when you come in, when you are inside an organization and you know their language and you know the rhythm and the cadence, and you can approach things in a particular way. But when you're an outside consultant, like the two of us, right? You're coming in, and I don't know about you, but I usually get greeted like this.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
What do you got?
Absolutely. For others who are on the outside here too, and if you're on the outside by choice because you're one of those weirdos who just likes the consultative kind of role, and I always gravitated to this work because it got me more exposure and more immersion in more varied things, and I love learning. So I'm like, oh, now I'm working in the automotive industry, and now I'm working in healthcare. Like, I wanted that, but it does mean there's this extra little thing that is here for us around, you have to somehow show up as an expert. Otherwise, we're not going to invite you in. And then you got to get inside and be like, surprise, you're the experts, not me, but without losing credibility. And, you have to speak their language before they let you in the door, but then you get in and so there's like, this all happens in sort of the opposite form on the inside, right? There's a complementary version of it. But for those consultants here in the mix who face that challenge, like, you're being told constantly by Knevin and Dave Snowden, and I agree to the nth degree on this, that it changes the nature of expertise, right? You're there to elicit or help facilitate everyone else's expertise and lived experience. But to earn the right to get in to do that, you got to tap dance as an expert in the first place. So it can be a fun cognitive dissonance that we all get paid to live in over here.
All fun all the time. Okay, breakout rooms.
Let's do breakouts. And I'm going to set the timer for these for, let's say, 10 minutes. Just because I want to make sure we can come back and have a little bit more time for any kind of Q&A and such. And if I can get...
Are we doing the same breakouts or randomizing?
I was going to randomize them. I
Cool.
thought maybe it'd be nice
let's
to get
do it.
people...
And then the same prompts, just what's coming up so far as we've all been talking.
And we can
we'll
repost if maybe you or somebody can grab. I did post the one we just responded to. Throw it in there in case anybody wants to grab it to be reminded. But yeah, you just heard me and Kyle say some stuff with Barbara in the mix. How are you feeling about it? What do you want to challenge? What do you want to hear more about? So let's see. Let's do 7 and change the time. And all right. Away you go. You guys were in breakouts. Maybe some interesting questions came up, or some things you want to hear more about, or some topics or things you're noticing. And any of the questions that were in the chat at some point and haven't really been covered or discussed or interrogated or explored, and you want to do that out loud, raise a hand.
Or if you put it in earlier and we missed it, you can put it back in so that I see it now, because there's a lot of chat. I don't know if you all realize how much chatting you've done. So if you ever had a question earlier and you cannot unmute yourself, put it back in the chat so I see it now. But otherwise, raise your hands and have at it.
Since folks are thinking, they're incubating their ideas for questions, I thought I'd pull out the one we saw earlier. I'm not going to scroll all the way back to find it, but it was basically a question around complexity, science, complexity informed practice, and then participatory methods. Do these go well together? There was a little bit of chat, and then there was a comment at some point. I would argue they're not even different, so I'd be curious if I pull that out and drag it out here. And I've butchered what the original sentiment was, but sorry, that's what you get for not asking it out loud just now. Kyle, what's your response to that?
Yeah, they're one and the same. You can't.
Period. Done.
That's it. Yeah. In fact, I probably am a little too flippant in the nature of that answer, in using them interchangeably. And it's probably a good reminder that I probably need to, when I'm talking about participatory design, I'm also talking about this is how we manage through complexity. It's not just the kumbaya of participation or inclusion. And also when I talk about we're working through complexity, that demands participation and representation to be able to get multiple perspectives, to navigate the plurality and the dynamics of a complex system. Those are that question is probably looming for 90% of the people that I talk to, at least on a regular basis. And so it needs to be much more explicit. And so I'm glad that question popped up.
Yes, Katie has popped it back in the chat. And I will now read it so that everyone knows.
Thank you, Barbara.
Are complexity science and participatory process well aligned? Are they poorly aligned? So that is the actual question, is like, how aligned are these practices?
Yes, and my brain is already thinking about like the vector, analysis of this. Complexity, science, all participatory process. No, is it complexity? All complexity is participatory, but not all participatory process involves complexity, right? I think that they're not. I agree on the surface with the assertion that they are one and the same, i.e. there were a couple people who said it in the chat, and then what Kyle just said. I think if you are doing any kind of work that is meant to be informed by what complexity, tells us about the nature of complex systems and humans and human dynamics, then if you're doing it right in the spirit of what that tells us, then yes, we're going to be engaged in participatory processes. But I do not think it's an automatic that we're doing it effectively, or that people understand what is meant by the word participatory. So when I think about the two vectors, I don't think they're always pointed like this. I think they're a little bit off. And I think a part of your ethical responsibility as a complexity-informed practitioner is getting those vectors as aligned as possible, in the sense that you have to actually be invested in ensuring everything Kyle just said is happening in your work. And it's a little easier to see in things like say you're using the SenseMaker tool, you're doing narrative research, you're doing some sense making with that. It's a little easier to see in a process like that we're actually engaging with the humans as co-designers or co-creators and ethnographers of their own experience, you're sort of putting some tools in their hands that enable them to tell you or to just articulate for themselves what a more desirable future might be, so that we can then start to shape things to try to get, into a more desirable state, but without doing that like future visioning and, casting and all of that. So I think it's easy to see this example in like concrete methods, but I think more philosophically, it can still be tough, especially when you're doing other things, other methods, other tools, other kinds of projects, even just from like a service design lens. Kyle and I talk a lot about how we'll still make ecosystem maps. We'll still journey map things, even though we have all the reasons we know that ain't how it really should go. But are there ways to make even that process more participatory? And then you have to think about, who the hell do you mean when you say participatory? I remember in the early days of my design phase of my career, encountering folks who talked a lot about co-design and participatory design. And what they meant was, instead of just the design team going away and doing the design, we invited the other business stakeholders to be involved and do some sketching on the whiteboard with us. And I was like, what? That ain't it. What about the users, the consumers, the humans on the other end of this experience, and everybody in between, the employees, the caregivers, everybody in the ecosystem who has some role of mediating or influencing this ecosystem out of which experiences emerge? So I think the reason I would say I don't think they are always one-to-one is not, I think the Platonic ideal is that yes, these things are one-to-one and the same. They are unity. But I think in the real world, they are not quite, because there is still a lot of fuzziness around what it means to engage in actually participatory practice. And this is different for people who are working in, say, social sectors, community-based work, as opposed to, say, working in corporate environments. You can talk to a lot of folks who do participatory design in corporate environments, and it just means gather a group of users in a conference room, do some work together for a day, and then send them on their way. And we've done some participatory design. And I won't malign that, to the extent that, as we were just saying earlier, that's a step in the right direction. But don't let that be the terminal, end of your growth and process here. Over time, you need to extend that to be something that is actually truly radically participatory, right? In the sense that Victor, whose last name I can never think of how to pronounce,
Hugo.
He writes about radical participatory design. So anyway, I'll stop there. I don't know if you want to take Greg's question or you want to say more yet.
You made me think of something real quick, and then let's go to Greg. If you want to dive deeper on that, Antoinette Carroll and Dory Tunstall do a lot of great work on community design, participatory design, and decolonization on the subject. And the simplest things that I try to hold with this is, it's not about stakeholders, customers. Well, impacted people deserve representation at the table, period. That's it.
Yeah.
Or nothing about us without us. That's sort of the bottom line approach to all of this.
Katie has put a wonderful link in the chat, by the way, for all of you, to a book on decolonizing participatory design and decolonizing design. So thank you, Katie.
Beautiful. The other is, participatory design is not consensus. We are exploring plurality, and so that requires a plurality of responses as well. So it is designing for the ends, not sort of trying to hammer out consensus among people. And I find that is often an assumption that comes along with the idea of co-design or participatory design that chases away a lot of people when I introduce this. And I don't do a good enough job to get in front of that early.
Yeah.
Usually it is a recovery of like, wait a second, I didn't mean we're going to bring more people to the table and then we're going to find consensus among all of those people. That's not it either.
Yeah, actually, that's a good reminder that I remember experiencing that quite a lot. There was a period where I actually did a lot of presenting and teaching on this topic. And there was almost a little bit of like a road show that I would usually do. And then even just in like as a sort of training process, to help people understand everything you've just said. And the notion that we're basically asking users to do our job. Okay, that's a fundamental misunderstanding of what we're even really talking about, which is, let's dissolve the concept of expertise a little bit here, not to erased the concept of rigor or grounding things in reality, but to say that we can acknowledge forms of expertise well outside typical, Western white historical kind of trends for that. But one other plug I'll make, especially if you are not in community-based work or social work, if you are stuck inside corporate shareholder-driven enterprise type work, there is actually also a lovely resource, many, from a woman named Liz Sanders. And she actually writes more about generative design here and using physical implements for making. It's not far from some of the thinking behind Lego, Serious Play. But what I really appreciate about Liz is that, people do mash up and confuse generative design, where we're going to make things together, with like the actual notion that we are inviting people and empowering people. And actually, hopefully we aren't even doing the empowering because we never had the power over them in the first place. But they're not quite the same, but I think they're really nice companions to each other. She has a book called Convivial Toolbox and lots of other white papers and things. But I just encourage people to check her writing out, because there is some usefulness there when you are constrained to time boxing or only being able to engage people in the community in this way. Sometimes it's hopefully a stepping stone towards bigger, more robust versions of all the things we've been talking about, narrative research and such. But nonetheless, another one to put in the list. Okay, Greg, your turn.
Yeah, thanks for that. And I was laughing because I've just produced a governance review, and at the heart of it, right in the middle, it says no decision about me without me. But the fun bit that comes with this is the mental blocks to the participation stuff. And I vividly recall a conversation in 2019 where a then director or was head of strategy and development spoke to me, and she was talking about my passion and enthusiasm for all of the people around the fringes of paddle sport, whether it was whitewater kayaking, sea kayaking, surfing, all of the things that were a little bit radical and different and all the rest. And she said, but Greg, my job as head of development is the people in the middle. And all of a sudden, out of nowhere, this was a completely emergent sort of thing. I came up with the idea that paddle sport's more like a ringed donut, or I think about it as a bagel. It's just got a hole in the middle. Every single person sees themselves as being marginal or fringe or whatever. And there was this huge amount of energy going into, the concept of doing participatory stuff would have been really appealing at that time for them, but they would have wanted to participate with the people in the middle. And of course, in the middle of a bagel, there's fresh air. The idea that you grow from around the edges, you grow where the energy's going in from all the enthusiasts and all the other thing. It's like, well, they're all the old timers. We've been talking to them for years. We need the new people. And you're like, well, that's the only place. And if you pour all the energy in down the middle, it just goes straight through. And I think there is a bigger point generally here that we can come up with a zillion ways of saying, yes, we want participatory this, but not with them. And getting over that hurdle has proven really, really hard for me, because the moment you can actually you attach a label to anything you don't like and just say, yes, but that's what we're trying to get beyond. We need the other voices. Yeah, we want inclusion, but actually all this ended up doing was excluding absolutely everybody that had actually got anything very useful to say, because they were actually had the benefit of, proximity.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, Kyle, you and I might have talked about this a little bit in one of our conversations. I keep alluding to the ones that are on YouTube. One of them, I know we spent a good amount of time on some of this very topic. I wish I could remember. I feel like what we had to say was quite smart. So maybe go back and watch that. I'm not going to try to recreate it. But this is hitting on a piece that I know I always think about and don't always articulate, which is to even think about participatory anything necessarily positions you and then everyone else, or you as the doer, the facilitator, the designer, whatever it is, you as the holder of the something that somebody else is being invited into. And even that alone then implies that you're going to have some level of thinking or conversation about who gets included and who doesn't. And, Kyle and I have talked before about how, like, if you follow the logic of inclusion and participatory ethics here, you want, epistemic justice to be served, and you want a level of humility and all of the things we're all, in service of. If you follow that logic to its extreme, you have to include everybody. like on the planet. Yeah, I mean, not truly, but like you get to that extreme, which then other folks might then say, well, we have to cut it off somewhere. So we have to now be the arbiters of who is actually, quote, included. And like we were saying about one of the other topics earlier, I find it far, far more effective to try to sidestep the question of who is included and who is invited to be a participant by acknowledging them, whether it's through, like Kyle said, thinking about them as anybody who's impacted people. Participant implies you're in and engaging in something, but everybody that we're talking about in these kind of scenarios is already engaged and impacted, whether or not they're an active participant. So using those small little judo flips in the language and then trying to find ways, it's not that you're asking for solutions here just to say yes and. I think that a lot of this comes down to how you can sort of earn those little rights to do different types of exercises or activities so people get to see. This is less about inviting a panel or a committee of people and making sure you pick the right ones, or making sure you anticipate the right representation and make sure it's, adequately representative, and instead finding ways to just be able to include as many perspectives as possible and let the question of who we care about their participation be dissolved altogether, or refuse to have that conversation, which not everyone has the ability to do. But
yeah, Greg, you reminded me of something that we probably, this is good. We're coming to this at the end of our time here.
I know, about to say we're out of time, right?
I can't emphasize this enough. This work is threatening. I want to say that louder and not like blow up my mic here. This work is threatening. We are proposing that there are other ways of knowing beyond expertise, where experts are experts because they've invested their careers becoming experts, and they want to hold on to that expertise and that station and that position of authority, that position of power. It introduces that there are different ways of knowing, there are different ways of working, things that have benefited people for a long period of time. And it's not that they just have their careers or their reputations built on this. They have their families established on this. They have their mortgage to pay for. They have, the threat of moving their kids out of the school if they have to go find another job in another town somewhere. There's a lot embedded in this. We are talking about changing things that affect people's lives across the board. And there are going to be people that are protective of this when we talk about influencing, that are going to do it not irrationally, but there's going to be more embedded in this resistance beyond whether or not we can articulate this or find the right language or connect it. There are people that have just been just privileged by how this system has worked for the last 40 years. And doing anything different is not of any interest whatsoever. And so the only thing that I've been able to sort of allow myself to like go to sleep at night with is that I just want them to name it. Like, I have run into those same stakeholders that are like, I don't want to hear from those people. Good. Document it. Broadcast it. If we can get to that point, that will send enough ripples that I can be comfortable with, because I can't change. I'm not in a position where I can change that. You're the decision maker at this point and you can make that call, but I want you to let everyone in your organization know that these people are not the ones that you want affecting your decisions, that are going to change the way that they operate and that the way that they collect their paychecks or the way they live, that sort of thing. And as long as we can do that, we're good. So if I can,
but they're not going to do that. You know that.
I've done it more than once.
But for the same reasons you're calling out, people operate with a level of fear for their own survival. And so in a lot of environments, they can recognize just as easily that to say any of that out loud is also bad, that they will either get hand slapped or far worse. And so it's so much more about understanding the fear. And not just, yes, you almost could be punitive in that way. I just want you to say it. I want you to say out loud that you don't want to talk to those people. Like, well, that
it's not like just a usual, but way I've been able to accomplish this before is that it's not just I don't want to hear from those people because they're those people, but I have to make certain concessions. And that's the concession that I'm willing to make is more it. That's a better way to put it.
That framing is really key, because I do think you'll find that people, and this is also probably a nice difference too that we experience, but even the few times in my life I've worked in-house, I've seen what you're saying. There's an interesting framework out there, and I'll say this briefly, and then I promise Barbara will let you talk. But there's a framework called immunity to change. It's from Robert Keegan. I don't actually love or like sponsor or like endorse the actual framework, but it's got its limitations. But I actually really like the metaphor, because if you think about why in that situation or any other, why wouldn't they be open to this? And if you actually kind of think about it, as most organisms, from an individual person to a team, to a company, to a wider system, kind of operate with a self-correcting or sort of self-protective instinct. And like in the body, sometimes the immune system can actually kind of go overboard, right? And you can have an autoimmune disorder, or you can have an immune system overreact to something that it really isn't a bad intruder. And so in much the same way, if you can get people thinking about what are my instinctive responses here, I'm not actually asking someone to do away with the immune system. It's healthy and it's good, but where might it be overreacting, or where might it be misidentifying the threat, So I hear what you're saying, Kyle, kind of as a version of that. And I think that's really key, but it is different from, I just want you to say it, admit you're stupid, that kind of thing. Like, admit you're racist. Like, that's not it. I don't want anybody to think that's what you're saying.
Right.
Go ahead, Barbara. I know you probably want to tie it up here.
For the recording, Kyle is not racist, nor are we accusing anyone else of being racist. However, no, actually what I wanted to say was that I think it is important to recognize that on the flip side of this expertise question, within an organization, there's often a lot of people who like there to be experts because they live in a blame culture, and I can blame the expert.
Yep.
So we're also talking about the diffusion of responsibility and accountability as well. And I think that's important to sort of mention, because I don't know, maybe I like everybody else to be responsible and not me, maybe I just want to cash the check and go home. But I think my basic point is that this is not straightforward. It is threatening, as you say, Kyle, to some of the entrenched power structure, but there are people that don't necessarily reap all the benefits of the entrenched power structure that are also very comfortable with it.
Sure. Without a doubt.
Yeah, and quickly for the record, I wasn't implying to be like, say you're not racist, Kyle. I meant more like what he was describing getting leaders to do, admit you don't want to do participatory design because you don't want to talk to those people. Because
I also mean, like, you don't want to talk to the call center.
Yeah, that's not what Kyle meant. And that's not what Kyle is actually trying to get leaders to do. And I kind of wanted to really make that super clear. I mean, yes, to Rob's point, I guess everybody's a little bit racist for all the reasons that we could get into sometime after hours. But again, comes to the structure versus individual attention again as well.
And Stephen, I take your point in the chat, but I'm really talking about these organizations where the culture is rooted in blame.
Yeah.
And there are a lot of them. There's probably more of them than we'd like to admit. But, that is when we're coming into an organization, when we're trying to do this work too, it's important to recognize those kind of cultural tropes as well. It's not just problem solving and hierarchy and things like that. It's sort of more like, how does that responsibility and accountability manifest itself within an organization?
So I'm happy to stay.
I was going to say, it's 2:08. I know people have had to drop off because it's getting later. Does anybody have anything they want to say to Jen and Kyle? Ask Jen and Kyle? I mean, it doesn't necessarily have to be about complexity. It could be about their tattoos. But it would help if it was about complexity and participatory design.
Yeah, let's riff.
Pardon, Kyle?
I said, yeah, let's riff. Whatever.
Yeah. I mean, don't make me call on y'all. We know how that goes. But, I'd love to keep this going. If not, if you're all happy and satisfied and ready to call it a day, we can do that too.
I want to note something that's, first of all, loving the conversation. And in previous conversations, people interested in complexity informed practices who are in corporate settings, the fact that you're working within institutions that are built to support the systems that we're in right now, like these conversations about values and threat and which levels of threatening you're doing are not side conversations to me. It's the core question. Like there are people who are, excuse the dog, people who are in between jobs, trying to define yourself as a service designer. Like there's all this jockeying so that the antibodies won't kill you, and that doesn't seem peripheral, seems core. And then again, I'm spoiled because I popped out of known space professionally a while ago.
Well, you put that one note in the chat to that end, and I was going to respond to it even if you hadn't raised your hand here, because there's also a flavor of this that tied to what you're saying, and even like yes and you have to acknowledge that if you at a certain point follow the thread on whether it's complexity, whether it's different forms of adjacent philosophical or other domain illogical ways of thinking, you eventually get to the conclusion where at some point this isn't a matter of just moving, wiggling the affordances until things that we like a little better start to emerge. Like there are entire structural assemblages that are out there. And a lot of the quote work we do is happening inside of or as part of these complex systems that themselves are dysfunctional or abusive or unhealthy in whatever ways you want to say it. And Kyle and I talk a lot about this. You guys have heard me probably say, if you follow me anywhere else, I often think about a lot of what I'm doing is kind of working behind enemy lines, which is a very crude way of putting it. But you really have to grapple as a practitioner with what you're doing and where you're doing it and what it's inside of and what it's in service of. And everyone's got to draw different lines. I like the way that Mike Montero talks a lot about this, if anyone knows him at all. You have to have sort of an ethical understanding of your own role and figure it out. But sort of in marriage to or braided with what you were saying, Rob, I think if nothing else, I would encourage folks who are in any kind of practice, again, not in like academia or, we're just talking about the jargon and the theory, but like you got to go make a paycheck and you're trying to pull some of these ways of working in. But at the end of the day, all you're really doing is ultimately helping someone get richer and hoping maybe off the side of that, you can serve some human on the other end of experience. And at least, again, in the States, I know this is true globally, but at least in America, I think people feel this really acutely these days. Most of the work we do is for or in service to or as a parasite on large financialized enterprises that live and die by quarterly earnings, and their number one priority is the profit motive to serve the shareholders. Any kind of service or experience that serves humans happens secondary to that. And I say this both to be like, hey guys, I see you, we all see this, but it doesn't mean that everything's futile. You can do a lot of good in small local contexts. And as hopefully a lot of folks in this complexity community know, small islands of coherence, right? Small, locally context-dependent interventions. These things can ripple and they can have effects. They can become lines of flight. They can do the things that we sometimes feel are impossible. So I appreciate you, Rob, for both calling that out, but then giving me a nice little launch pad to say my piece there, because sometimes I think people need to hear it and we see it and we're all in it together.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll say
okay,
a core of the work that I do is I've worked in heavily regulated industry, primarily in finance. We have formalized ways of acknowledging our structures. We have our org charts, we have our process maps, we have our SOPs and our audit documents and risk management tools and all of that fun stuff. But when you come in and do sense making on top of that, that's how do we talk about the way that these things work? How do we think about our relationships? What's the informal org chart and the influence that happens? What's the colloquial way that we manage all of this sort of stuff? And when we start expressing that, not only were we sort of calling bullshit to the way that we've documented these things for the sake of regulators, but we're also acknowledging that there's a whole other structure that supersedes what we think is the sort of formalized structure. So again, very threatening. But to your point, Rob, this is the important work, because when we are acting in one way while we're holding up this map of a terrain that does not exist and saying this is how things are supposed to work, and there's that gap there that's not doing us any good, that's a lot of the breakdown that needs to happen. We need to kind of push through that threat and the people that are being sort of bothered by that, and sort of that we're afraid of that ourselves, because that's the structure that is kind of holding us together. The moment we realize that that's going to fall apart, that means we're on unstable ground. So who is going to show us the SOP? And now what are we accountable for? They can fire us for anything if we're not accountable for anything anymore. Like the whole bottom drops out. So like, how do we now sort of swim in this new space? Is a great question, but we do have to start to. That a lot of my work is asking that question of what are these informal structures that actually exist.
Okay, Jen.
Oh, you're muted.
She's working on it. She's
yeah.
She's got it. There we go.
Okay. I can't believe, Barbara, you let me say 2 sentences without telling me that I'm muted. Anyway, I just want to say thank you for, to Kyle and Jen for like allowing this very session be the very embodiment of what the topic, like complexity and participatory design. And I bet this is kind of like an example how meaning and even dissent and even, some good bits emerged from this whole process. And thank you for your courage to do that with this group. I really appreciate that. And I want to pick up on what Barbara and perhaps also Jen, you mentioned on this, blame and entitlement culture. Like it's safer for me to feel there is someone has to change. The management has to change. Someone to point the finger at. I just want to share a small. This is only a one-off experience, but I just Peter Block has these 6 conversations, and it's kind of a relational methodology. One of them is called an ownership conversation. And basically, this methodology is framed by questions, open-ended, unanswerable questions. So at one time, I was facing this very wicked situation that with this blame culture. So basically, out of frustration, I just smuggled I call myself a change smuggler. So I smuggled these small things into a very linear and top-down design process we're doing. And just a small reflective conversation. And it has 2 parts and very simple. And it's basically a little bit copy-paste Peter Block. So the first part is basically asking people to say, brainstorm on the problems they see as really tough to solve and whatever, and basically having an accountability discussion. And you see all these input about they, them, and they, and what is it you and then the second question is a little bit hard. It took me a lot of courage to actually ask it that way. Peter Block put it. What is your part in contributing to the very thing you're complaining about? And I thought, okay, I'm going to be burned, and nobody wants to pick up on that. But I think I was helped by the frustration, the tension that was really, really brewing in that group. And just one person picked up on that, and it was a game changer. And I think that person who took that social risk, I was forever grateful for that. And basically, what I saw was indeed the magic of connection that is coming from the shared struggle, and that ironically, that didn't change the behavior of the top management at all. I think if it changed anything at all, as I perceived it, is the agency, is the perception of agency from the bottom. And I try to comfort myself with Alicia Guerrero's, this enabling constraints. Somewhere on the way, it can become this constitutive constraints, and by by volition from the bottom, it can become a governing constraint in a different way. I did not have the luxury as a consultant to see the cause and effect that were far apart in time and space to play together in that organization. But I was hoping that I planted a seed. I just want to share that small thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I love that. I love that. And it's actually really the immunity to change framework that I mentioned, or like the concept of like organizational antibodies. A lot of what like Keegan's thinking there is actually, I find, better served by methods like Peter Block's that you just mentioned, because it does encourage folks to kind of look at their own roles and being immersed within something instead of just us versus them. So I love everything about that. But I also wanted to say, what I'm also hearing you describe is, yeah, maybe leadership did or didn't change in response, but you're talking about the substrate level, right? Ye old substrate, our favorite, right? Like that's where we got to work. So, who knows what's going to go on over there, but even small changes to the substrate in which other things can ripple up or down. Great example.
I don't know why this reminded me of this, but we were dismantling some piece of software and big process and replacing it with something else years and years ago. And the team I was with, I had them because there were so many people that were sort of embedded in this, and they were a little reluctant, like, you'll never come up with something new. It was sort of the part of the like cloud transformation work, and it was the old server guys that were like, there's no such thing as clouds. It's all terrestrial. It's, it's just in a different building. And so like, stop wasting your time kind of guy. And there was so much cynicism around this. And we had a workshop where we weren't doing anything generative. Weren't doing anything generative in the traditional sense of, okay, what are we going to do next? We weren't building our vision. Instead, we got a bunch of like our corporate jargon, our images, like all of our marketing paraphernalia with all of the like photos of people doing interesting things and posing in cute ways and all that sort of stuff. And we put thought bubbles on them and speech bubbles, and we had them roasting the process we were doing. And we came up with various memes. Like, I don't know if you've seen like the Hitler meme, the video of like Hitler losing his mind and screaming at everybody. Like, people did the overdubs for that and that sort of stuff. But it was just this open-ended roast of this, but it was disassociated in a way that it was funny, but it wasn't one person complaining or pointing fingers at another person. It was us sort of laughing at ourselves and the space we all coexist in. And it was sort of cathartic because there wasn't one person that could sit down and say, I really defend this. I'm not really pointing a finger in a particular direction either. It's not anyone else, but like, yeah, this is kind of funny how antiquated this whole thing has become and how much time we spend lighting our hair on fire trying to keep this thing alive. So yeah, let's mock it for a moment and then let's come together and think about what other possibilities are out there.
Okay, for the recording, the Complexity Lounge does not endorse Hitler memes.
Neither do I.
I felt like I needed to put that on record.
You do nowadays.
Okay, so Kinsey and then Jocko, and then we're going to wrap it up. Okay, so Kinsey?
I'm going to try to recapture it. It was when Jen was talking about, just following up to Rob's question in the chat, and about the structures inherently problematic, to say the least, and about the challenge of working within those structures. And I know that in Kyle, you mentioned Dory Tunstall, and at some point in the last couple of years, she left her position at, I think it was University of Toronto, because she didn't want to be part of a structure that perpetuated those.
Yeah, OCAD.
And so there's that. And that's one approach, and legitimate. I think it's necessary to have that that narrative and that behavior. My position has always been that it is not only possible to work within structures, but necessary to work within those structures to disarticulate the mechanisms of that imperial past and the discriminatory systems that are embedded in them. And it's really, has been a really context. I've worked in museums, and so that those were significant. I mean, that was a significant experience because museums were not just pivotal, but foundational to the organizational structures and the operational mechanisms of like power differentials as they've been perpetuated over a couple hundred years. And so it was really in curating exhibitions was a methodology more than a vocation for me. And it enabled me to get down to those structural elements that where it's not about experience or oppression or the aspects that are as much front of mind. It's at a level where it's just about levers and how they operate. And so that's why I've gotten into other kinds of organizations and sectors, or I want to, because there's so much continuity. It's amazing. And so I see in case studies, people mention like a lot of the intervention points that I had to deal with, but they're not things that are consciously in mind because they're so internalized and normalized. They're not even seen. And so that makes me think of the donut, Greg, talking about the insiders and outsiders. And that differentiation is one of the constructs of power. And so what happens if you take out those boundaries between them and that space between, I find that's where I work. I work in the interstitial spaces and the negative spaces, and it's really play space. And that's where the opportunity and creativity is. And so rather than being like where things fall through, I think when there's conflict, I find that it's fruitful. And this kind of gets at the S-Ring mapping workshop. Like this was a way that I was thinking about it in terms of visualizing it in the language that Dave uses, because breaking things down to the point where there's something in common, that's a more solid foundation to build from. And then get to the point of where it's contested space, it's not about compromise necessarily, but about what possibilities for something different is there in that place. So anyway, all I have to say is that in institutions, I think it's necessary to do work there and work within the constraints to disarticulate them.
I will just say this briefly because I just rewatched classic 90s film Judgment Night. Okay. And there's a scene in Judgment Night where one of the characters is like giving money to somebody else, and the person who's receiving it looks at it and it's got blood on it. And he goes, "There's blood on that money." And the guy says, "Have you ever seen any that doesn't have it?" We all have to operate. You have to operate in a world where the day you're born, you are complicit in some form of violence. So you get to choose where and how you either do or don't point in that direction. And nowhere is there a hard boundary, not at all. You get to define it and pick it. So I feel you on all that. Kyle, I don't know if you want to say anything or you want to see what Jocko has to say.
Didn't we just talk about this? You only need the Judgment Night soundtrack. You never need to watch the movie.
Yeah, you actually don't need both. You don't need either.
No, you did at the time. No, I like just plus one. That's all. It's like somebody was asking me recently about like what's the industry where you're not going to like sell your soul, and the answer is it's not there. You just have to find where you can find here we go, leverage points where you can sort of have enough of an impact doing what you want, or where your values can align.
Your values. A lot of people try to do the calculus to find out the objective number of where can I do the most good or do the least harm, as if there's like an actual equation out there that gives you the answer, but they forget to include the variable that is for them as an individual, the ways they've been wired to care about other humans and what their individual skills and interests kind of bring. So yeah, like, isn't it? I mean, where's the end of the forest? Where's the edge of the deer? Where's the Nora Bateson style? Or I first got into that way of thinking well before back, I think when I read like I Contain Multitudes, but where's the edge of the bad and the
all right. Now, with the final complexity lounge question of 2025, and on a note of complicity, here is Jocko Selberg.
Hi, how's my mic? Can you hear me?
Oh, you sound lovely. You've never sounded better.
I want to go back to something that you had mentioned, Barbara, is the question of accountable versus responsible. That also has come up several times in the conversation, and I think it underlies a lot of this stuff. One of the things that it's connected to is the creation of blame culture or psychological safety or fear or all of that stuff. Now, I've recently had a conversation on a different thread about one of the problems with the term value is that you can't define it. And what I mean by the fact that you can't define it is I know that you, Jen, could define it. I know that Kyle could define it. I know that everybody on this call can define it, but the definitions are always different, as they should be, and they're different depending on the context that you're operating on. Therefore, the word value doesn't have much value as a term because it's always different. Now, to bring it back to accountable and responsible, now again, I know that it's not a problem that anybody can't define what the differences are of those two, but I've heard so many that I don't even know what the difference between the two are anymore because I've heard them flipped and flipped again. With the exact same definitions applied to the other word. So again, this underlies a lot of this stuff, even if we're talking about consultants or working inside an organization or any of this methods that we're trying to use and all that kind of stuff. How would you guys look at that question of accountability and responsibility?
I have
pushing the hair back.
I take so much pleasure after we talked so much earlier about being like nerds about language and about like semantics. But if you just think about the words, like responsible is from like, I don't know if it's Latin or Greek or whatever, but like the root is like to answer to pledge, to answer, to commit, something along those lines. I'm not looking it up and I don't care if I'm wrong. I'm sorry. It's recorded. Everybody knows. Versus accountable, like accounting, we have to account for. And so it almost, and I don't expect the world to be like, oh, Jen's right. These are the definitions we're all going to use from now on. But I feel like regardless of which ones you're actually using in what scenarios, so much of this is so usually much more about what someone wants to do with the notion of responsibility or accountability. Is it a preemptive or a proactive? This is something I have agency about or within. This is an environment where I can acknowledge my own role, whether it's something that I can influence directly or only indirectly. You know, just thinking about the nature of your role and whether you have some form of active potential within it, rather than I am the person who, if something goes wrong, I have to make it right, or I will be blamed, or what have you. And like forgetting about the words responder. Oh, I wasn't that far off. Okay, thank you. But basically, I feel like, at least in my work, so much of this, and I work with a few organizations that are very fear and blame cultures. And nobody wants to stick their neck out to do anything anywhere ever, because even if it's a good thing, they've stuck their neck out. So they will be accountable. And if something goes in any way that isn't perfect, that neck is right there waiting for the chop. And I've kind of found that it's so much less about, you know, how do we have to make sure someone's accountable before or after we do something? And it's what is actually happening upstream from a I say upstream in both time and place kind of thinking that is making it such that these folks can't find a space in which to do work where they're not sticking their neck out. So creating some sort of those containers, the trust, the protected space, like when people go on about silos and then someone like Dave Snowden comes in and says, sometimes silos are okay. You need the protected space, you know. Anyway, those are where my instincts are at. It's not a full answer, but for me, it's really the difference between acknowledging and actually taking advantage of an active influencing role as a responsible person or responsibility versus accounting. To me is often about accountability, as in someone's got to account for this in a measured and metric and outcome oriented way.
Can I respond to that real quick? It's interesting that the answer that you gave was from an individual's definition on their own part.
Well, you could apply it at other scales. I just used individual like for the ease of the conversation, but you could, I think I would say it the same way, whether I was talking about a team or an organization too.
Well, what I was getting at is that that's not so much the problem, I don't think. I think it's not that difficult for people to define for themselves what they're accountable for and responsible for. Where the problem occurs is when different parts of the organization or that individual is saying, who's accountable for that out there?
Right.
That's what triggers the blame. It's not so much what I'm accountable for, unless it's coming at me and somebody's pointing the finger at me. That's what I mean is that sort of underlies all this is not having, it comes up all the time as the core problem when I go into a group is that nobody feels that there is any accountability. And so the organization tends to overreact to that.
Well, that's a good, I feel like that's a great link to Jen. I'm pointing down because she's right below me in the Zoom, but the Peter Block, any kind of dialogic kind of work that is about ownership in that way kind of hints at some of that. But once again, there's a certain point after which, if psychological safety is an emergent property of a system and not something you can engineer, if culture is an emergent property, I think in much the same way, that blame culture, that accountability culture, I'm on a team that says, that's them over there. That's their problem. I can't take ownership on this because if I do, it's not mine to have. And if I do, it'll just backfire. Like some of that is to me still at that emergent level and not the substrate level. What's the substrate version of the accountability responsibility piece that you're at? That's probably the more interesting question.
Yeah. If you see me wincing over here, it's because the number of races that I've had to direct over the years, and that question comes up.
R versus the A.
I was going to put it in the chat that we need a good, far be it for me to defend the racing, but
I am. All the scars are exposing themselves as I'm hearing so much about the somatics of sense making that I'm attuning to how my body is recoiling from this question. So I think when this comes up, this is where I was talking about before, the informal structures is where I like to go to. I really loved thinking about the transborder resources conversations that are happening. Nobody's really talking about it or nobody's attributing it to complexity, but things like the dams that are being built in Ethiopia right now that are going to affect the Nile in Egypt, or how Canadian wildfires were affecting you guys in New York last year, these sort of things. It doesn't really matter some of these arbitrary boundaries that we've built in our organization or how we name things. What I see when I think of a RACI is a cause-effect relationship. And in some contexts that might work, but if we're having a really hard time getting to that level of definition, then it's probably because it might not exist or it might not be effective in the conversation that we're having. So understanding the more colloquial way that we're working, how are we actually considering these things in multiple contexts, different people across the organization or in different groups, how are we talking about who do we go to for this thing? It might be multiple places, whether or not they're accountable or responsible from a official documented perspective, but it's still valid.
There's also a learning piece to add on, because I hear what you just said, Kyle, and that's the next piece. I was like, yes. And there was once I shared there was an article about just culture, in the sense that air crash investigation, comes in and it's really important to kind of maintain the opposite of blame culture, just culture, however you'd like to phrase it. Because if you really want to live by that motto about every crash makes us safer, you've got to be able to investigate every corner and have people be not afraid to share any and everything, so that we can figure out what went wrong, even if it was human error, so that we can then make everybody safer. And it was a good article. It's about how, the NTSB and others, conduct these investigations. If you're a nerd about aviation, you already know it all. But I shared that with some friends and clients at an organization that is the blame culture. And I was really intrigued to see how they would respond to it. And most of them said, I would love it if we could be this way. I think the main challenge is that everything about what's in the article is all effective and possible because everybody agrees the goal is to learn. It's learning and it's adapting and it's iterating to make everybody safer. And they said, here in this environment, that is not our goal. And even if we talk about it or pay lip service to it, our goal isn't to learn and to get better. Our goal is to make money. And they got real effing honest real quick when they had that like example to contrast it with. Sometimes that is something that is, again, out of control, like our control. We can't change the way that their executive team and their board dictate some of the substrate, but it was really powerful them to just kind of say that out loud. Like, yeah, so there's a level of, agency, a limit to our agency in that we will never become an organization that actually wants to invest in learning and improving the experience and products we deliver, because that's not our actual stated goal. And it is not even what the company is built for. And so recognizing that can feel like fatalist for sure, but I think it's powerful. It gave some of these people a renewed sense of where to put their energy and where not to. And it helped a couple of them decide to leave.
I think that's a better way of what I was saying about naming it before than saying, hey, admit that you're a racist. It's more like stuff like that.
That was me mischaracterizing you on purpose. You didn't say that. Yeah. No, that's fair. I think it's kind of, similar.
Yeah. That's where
I don't think we did your question justice, Jocko, but maybe we'll take it up in a future Jen Kyle recorded conversation.
I think this is the seed of the next Complexity Lounge conversation. I mean, I think we could do an entire session about that in 2026.
I agree. I think that's a whole session.
Yeah, I think we've got a whole session on our hands here, because this is, I have to say, Kyle, that RACIs were a response to some of the things that we are talking about. They were obviously degraded and abused in many instances, but when you think about the impetus behind the creation, it's not wrong.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Dave is raising his actual hand.
I've considered it a victory every time I've talked a group out of doing a RACI. but it's a well-meaning, complicated response to how people want to address the problem of ambiguous roles and responsibilities.
Yeah. It's a complicated response to a complex question is really what we're talking about, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
But well-meaning.
Yeah. Oh, and as I say, I believe the initial impetus behind it was probably good to try to, it was limited, but it was good to try to address some of the very questions we're talking about. Okay. So does anyone else have anything they'd like to add before we say goodbye to the Complexity Lounge for 2025? Going once, going twice. Okay. Jen, Kyle, final thoughts.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dave.
Hey, thank you. Thanks to everyone who showed up, and thanks to everyone who might listen to this later, and anybody who might reach out to generate more conversation. Somebody said earlier, and I forget who, but I appreciate them calling out that part of what Kyle and I are trying to do is literally model what we're talking about. So these are all probes, and you guys are part of that process. So we appreciate it.
Yeah. I was going to spin that another way. I'm not going to. Thank you thank you for joining us today. And this has been really wonderful. This community, this group, thank you for hosting this. This has been really valuable for me over the years to really understand this space. And, I think it needs to be said also when we were talking about community that not just the confidence building and how we go out and talk about this, but like making this space. When you get those DMs from people saying, hey, I'd like to geek out. If you're interested in investing in this space, respond to those graciously. And if you've got the time, have those one-on-ones, have those coffee talks, because so many people have done that for me. Please, I invite you all to reach out to me. I will make that time. But that is really critical in being able to help us form that language and hear that we're not lone wolves off in our own places when we leave Complexity Lounge and we go into organizations full of people saying, I don't understand what you're talking about, that we do have a common language and people encouraging us to move forward. So really appreciate this space and all of you joining it.
Well, thank you. We want to thank you two for coming on and doing another one of these sessions. They are wonderful. I think they give us a different perspective on some of the things that we talk about in our more formal lectures, and we really appreciate that. And of course, you two are both really awesome presenters. So thank you so much for that. And thank you to all of you in the audience. You know, we've been doing this now. This is our 5th year of the Complexity Lounge, and we keep doing it because you all keep showing up. So, keep showing up, and hopefully next year we're going to have a great program of things for you. We're trying to expand our offering. Maybe there'll be more Kyle and Jen if they agree to come back. But regardless, we will do our best to bring you speakers on every aspect of complexity, science, and thinking. So whatever you celebrate, I hope you have a wonderful end of the year. And thanks again. Thank you, everybody.